Once there lived a village of creatures along the bottom of a giant crystal river. The current of the river swept silently over them all, young and old, rich and poor, good and evil, the current going its own way, knowing only its own crystal self. Each creature, in its own manner, clung tightly to the twigs and the rocks of the river bottom, for clinging was their way of life, and resisting the current was what each had learnt from birth. But one creature said at last, "I am tired of clinging. Though I cannot see it with my eyes, I trust the current knows where it is going. I shall let go and let it take me where it will. Clinging, I shall die of boredom." The other creatures laughed out loud and said, "Fool! Let go and that current you worship will throw you tumbled and smashed across the rocks, and you will die quicker than boredom." But the one heeded them not, and taking a deep breath, he let go, and at once was tumbled and smashed by the current across the rocks. Yet, in time, as the creature refused to cling again, the current lifted him free from the bottom, and he was bruised and hurt no more. And the creatures downstream, to whom he was a stranger, cried, "See, a miracle! A creature like ourselves, yet he flies! See the Messiah, come to save us all!" And the one carried in the current said, "I am no more Messiah than you. The river delights to lift us free, if only we dare to let go. Our true work is this voyage, this adventure." But they cried the more, "Savior!" all the while clinging to the rocks. And when they looked again, he was gone, and they were left alone, making legends of a savior. I'm Shar Banerjee, your host of Books That Built Me. Today we're in conversation with Stéphanie Laflamme, and the book that this excerpt is from is called Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by Richard Bach. So glad you could join us. Here we go. Welcome, Stéphanie. We are joined in studio by Stéphanie, who is a leadership coach and current faculty member in the Leadership Circle Profile. She is a pilgrim in consciousness and is always in search of what there is to discover in life. Welcome to the podcast, Stéphanie.
Thank you, Shar. I'm happy to be here.
Yay, me too. So the book that we're talking about today is Illusions, this tiny little guy. I think I read it in a couple of hours, really. So it's called Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by Richard Bach. And my first question for you is, what's the story? What's the story behind this book?
I would say that this book is about two guys who are on a different life's journey, and they get to learn together for a short period of time. One of the guys is actually someone who in his life's journey have learned a lot and have grown a lot and has become what we could call a messiah, and decided, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And it's his own journey of exploring that reaction towards this mission that he had been faced with. That's one guy. The other guy, he's a guy who's just, I want to become a messiah. What's that about? How do we do this? And it's both of their journeys with two different perspectives over the same type of role and contribution that one can do in life, and how they grow together towards that perspective.
Yes, so there's a reluctant messiah and then there's a deliberate messiah. But
yeah, exactly.
And the deliberate messiah, though, he's kind of seen the not so great stuff about being a messiah and being recognized as a messiah. And the reluctant messiah kind of already knows that that's not the lifestyle that he wants. So there's almost this awareness that the reluctant messiah already has.
Exactly. And the aspiring messiah is I feel he just wants the knowledge, the know-how, but not the rest. Like he just want the knowledge of the Messiah, but not the role of it.
Oh, yeah. I love that. Actually, how you said that he wants the knowledge of it, but not the responsibility or not the role. I don't know if responsibility is the right word, because what are you responsible for, actually?
Yeah, and there's actually a quote in there that say that one way to and I cannot actually remember the right wording, but it's like one way to not embrace your responsibilities is to say I have a lot of responsibilities. So I find it interesting that you're talking about responsibilities.
Actually,
Yeah.
that's where this awareness is coming from, because that quote is a good one, right? And I have heard it before. Like, I can't take this on. I have way too much other stuff that I'm responsible for. And responsibility seems to be a central theme in this book. Like, whose is it to own? Is it yours? Is it theirs? Is it a shared connection?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is something along the lines of responsibility. I had not seen it this way, but you're right. And my understanding of it was we are all responsible for our life's reaction and our life's perception. And that's a perspective, and that's the superpower that all of us have.
Yes.
And we live, I find, in a society where it's everything enables us not to be responsible and not to take responsibility for our own feelings, and to kind of start the blaming game in an elegant way or not an elegant way. Sometimes like, well, it's super obvious, and some people are more refined in how they do not take responsibility for their perceptions and their life experiences. Yeah. And their beliefs, actually, because I think this book is all about like the illusion, in my interpretation, that's mentioned is this is all about we have beliefs that we're unaware of, and these beliefs will modify the way we experience life. So if we change the belief, we change the way we experience life.
Yeah.
But most of us do not recognize that we're driven by these beliefs and these assumptions, and once we start to unearth these, then we become more powerful, and we can be more deliberate about what we believe in and about what we want to create and contribute in the world.
Yes. This book, so for anyone who hasn't yet read this book, I think you said it beautifully about a reluctant Messiah and a deliberate aspiring Messiah. Just to give them some names, basically the reluctant Messiah's name is Richard, and the aspiring Messiah's name is Donald Shimoda. Right? So
I think it's the opposite, right? The reluctant one, the one who doesn't want to be a messiah, who's like, screw this, I don't want to do this.
Sorry.
Is Don Shimoda.
Is Don Shimoda,
and
yes.
Like the author, actually, is like he's using his own name.
Correct.
And he's the one who's aspiring to become a messiah.
Okay, so flipped. The reluctant one is Donald, and then the one who's deliberately wanting to learn this craft is Richard.
Yes.
Okay, so now that we have that down, I wanted to ask you about the representation of certain things in this book, because this book is all about flight, airplanes and being in the air and giving people a 10-minute plane ride for $3, and this love of flying, this love of taking care of your aircraft. And it's just so omnipresent, this metaphor of being in flight. What do you think is the relationship between what the bottom line of this book is when it comes to like illusions and what we think about the world and this metaphor of being in flight?
I know that the author in other books is a true pilot, right? It's not made up story. Like he really does this piece of the story.
Yeah.
And he just loves flying. And I remember that when I first read this book as a teenager, for me, I kind of got this inspiration that being a pilot would mean total freedom. And he's flying a small aircraft, right? So and so he doesn't need like a flight plan and like to report to anybody. He just goes up, does his thing, and goes back down.
Yeah.
So there's something about this. I'm not gonna I want to say unity, but it could be something else. It could be more this relationship with the surroundings, with the environment, with the weather, with the like when they're trying to find for a nice field to land, like all of this kind of symbiosis almost with what is around them, to be in harmony. That maybe that kind of fly with, and just kind of this acceptance of what is and adaptation with what it is, a little bit like a surfer, even though a surfer does not fly. Or maybe
No,
he
I
does
get it.
sometimes. But
I know, I get it. I think it's like that same idea of, where the medium is air. For surfer, the medium is water. It's like, it's very similar
Yeah.
in that, and in
Yeah.
my research, actually, this book is written after his other book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Is that a book that you've
Yes.
read as well?
I did,
Okay,
yes.
so that book as well has the theme of being in flight a lot. And so this book is all about a bird who is a young seagull named Jonathan Livingston, who's different from other birds. And, instead of just focusing on finding food and surviving, he's passionate about flying. And he dreams of flying faster and flying higher than any other seagull. And the bottom line is that, as he pursues this craft, he finds others who think like him, and he has a community of others. And so it's like this beautiful story of self-discovery and figuring out where you fit, where you belong, why it matters to ask those questions and to relentlessly be in pursuit of what makes your heart sing. And so I wanted to bring up the flight conversation because I'm like, it's so connected to what he does. And I actually didn't realize before you told me he's a pilot himself.
Yeah.
Okay.
He is. He is. He is. And there's a when I reread the book in preparation for this conversation, I discovered that there was Illusions 2, which I was not aware of, and I read it.
Okay.
And Illusions 2, he actually, for the first time in his pilot career, he crashes. He has a very small aircraft and he crashes and he
Okay.
almost dies. So the story is about what happens when he's in the coma. And in his coma, all of his book characters come back to him, and Donald Shimoda is one of them, and he has conversations with them.
Right.
And about, is this real? Is this not real? What is reality?
Right.
And there's this always affirmation that his wife told him on one of the first time he actually woke up, which is, I am the perfect expression of perfect love here and now.
Mm-hmm.
Everything can heal. And he was, according to what he explained, he was like, doctors thought him like he's good, he's going to die.
Mm-hmm.
But he kept saying and repeating that affirmation, which now we've made a full recovery of this. And in the book, there's a picture of his aircraft because he had this attachment with his aircraft, with this small airplane, and it got repaired, even though most people would have said, no, it's beyond repairs, just like him. And that way he got connected with the soul of his aircraft.
So this is a real story.
Well, you mean the second one?
Yeah, that he got into an accident.
I would think so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there might be a little bit of
Sure.
of creativity. I don't know, but but the accident is real. Yeah.
My gosh. Speaking of creativity, let's get into some of the creative details in this book. And I'm curious to know kind of what your take is on this. There is a part in the book where Richard constantly talks about this bread that he makes that is so not delicious to Donald. And Donald and Richard have this constant bickering about this, to Richard, the most delicious bread, but to Donald, the most disgusting thing that nobody should even have the displeasure of consuming.
Yeah.
What's the point of that part? Like, I was laughing my head off because it's so funny and so silly. And then it got me thinking, like, is this detail an important detail?
I would think so, because I think this is a perfect example of how illusions play a part in our life. If I'm expecting this piece of bread because I put all my love into it and I'm expecting it to be that way, it's going to taste good for me. But if I don't have any expectations, I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to taste it with like kind of a zero biases or little biases, then I'm going to taste it for what it really is. A little bit like parents with their children.
Yeah.
So, oh my God, this is the most amazing child of all. Like, we're all biased when we look at our children because they're the best people in the world, right? So these types of things, I think for me, this example of the bread is just a perfect example of how illusions play a part in the way we perceive things and experience them.
Oh, that's a beautiful way of putting it. That's a great way of putting it, that illusions is actually the highlight here in this silly example of this bread that they that they get to make. So talking about illusions, right? Like, if you were to create your own illusion, and this is inspired from this book, the way that he does it, right? But if you were to create your own quote unquote illusion to either challenge or enlighten somebody, what would it be in like today's modern day, you know, like for as you if you think about a modern day Messiah, because that's the other thought that I have here, is that the book is suggesting that anyone has the potential to be a Messiah in their own right. Right? And so if I think about the modern day Messiah, if you were challenged to create your own illusion to challenge them or enlighten somebody, what do you think that would be?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that my understanding is that we all live in an illusion. Like we're all in the world of illusions, and your reality is way different than mine. So I'm not sure if I fully understand your question. Is it about how? Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
That's okay. Let's redo this question. Okay, so the book suggests that anyone has the potential to be a Messiah in their own right. Let's dive into the modern day Messiah, because this book was written in the 70s, right? What do you think are some
83? No, 70s? Yeah.
Was it not 70s? I thought
maybe it's the 70s, maybe 83 was the French version, I don't know.
Ah, okay. Okay, I saw copyright 1977.
Oh yeah, so there you go.
But okay. I can double check that. But you know, like that's a significant number of decades in the past now. And so if you think about modern day and like the modern day Messiah, what qualities or attributes do you think define the you and me of today, and how can we cultivate some of these modern day Messiah qualities within?
That's a good question. One of the challenges I think we're facing in the modern days, it's the overstimulation of everything, of external senses.
Right.
I think we have this tendency as a species to be outward looking, to be oriented towards what's happening outside, and not always paying attention to the interaction between what's happening outside and how does that echoes within me. And so I would think that a modern day Messiah would be very grounded in the present moment, would be very open and receptive, would also embody love and acceptance. And given the times that we're in, I would also think that a modern day Messiah would be maybe a little bit action oriented. Not just like saying speeches in front of everybody.
Right.
But I'm feeling maybe somebody who takes action. Maybe.
That's a great point.
That's one option. I think there would be many, but that's one of them, yeah.
That's a great point, because the word Messiah has this connotation of somebody who gives speeches, who sits at the center, who answers questions and sort of like delivers wisdom on a platter. And I love that insight that you bring of like today, that's actually not necessarily going to land as much as being more action oriented and more in the doing space.
Yeah, and also on that note, I think we live in a world that has a lot of content, a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's easy to be shared and to be generated, and everybody right now could be a content generator and publish it into the world.
That's true.
A little bit like the Atlantis myth, right? It's like there's so much knowledge that basically kills the civilization of Atlantis, right?
Yeah.
So I'm feeling that a today's Messiah might not be. There would be knowledge, but it would be embodied knowledge, like knowledge shared with demonstration and concrete action, and maybe in a way that inspires others, and a deep presence, like a deep. Yeah.
I feel like you're saying they will be living it. It's not just talking about it. It's living it.
Exactly.
It's demonstrating it through living it.
Yeah.
You mentioned Stephanie earlier that you read this book when you were a teenager.
Yeah.
And when you and I were talking about this podcast, this was the book that you said, Shar, this is the one that changed my life. Like I would love to know a little bit more about the history there and what's happened and yeah.
Well, thank you for asking this. I find it interesting because I remember I was in my house and I was looking for a book, and we had this book in our house library.
Okay.
And like I'm not from a family that reads a lot of books, and furthermore, not spiritual books. Like it was like just the fact that this book was there, I'm still to this day not understanding why it was there. Like I have no idea why we had this book in my house.
Wow.
So I read it because the format and the image on it, like I was drawn to it. And when I first read this book, it was a revelation that some of the thoughts and ideas and feelings I was having were not abnormal, and that there was something of a higher sense to this, a higher calling, a higher longing. And about that time, I started to make some experiments with meditation, and so for me, and it was rough. My teenage years were a bit rough, like most people.
Yeah.
And for me, it was kind of a really grounding, self-confirming experience to read this book, and I read it almost every year, if not twice a year. Yeah.
Wow. You read it every year, if not twice a year. For how many years now?
Yeah.
Well, no, you don't
read it like
you don't have to answer that
I'm
question.
thinking, like, I must have read that book like 20 times or something.
Wow.
Like the fact that I could come up with, there's a quote about responsibility.
Yep.
I didn't write it down, I just remember it. Like,
Yeah.
so there's a few things in that book that are just speaking to me. And what I find interesting is that every time I read it,
Yeah.
a different part of it is highlighted for me. It's like, oh yeah. So yeah, for me it's a book that is just it's a simple way to talk about deeper truths of life, I would say. Yeah, for me anyways. Like I know it's very subjective,
Of course.
and other people have different beliefs and it works.
Yeah.
But for me, that fully aligns with my definition of what life is and what our purpose on this planet is about.
I really love and appreciate philosophical allegories like this book that enable us to get to the truth that we're seeking through story, right? Like there's some creativity associated with this. And I think that what you said is so true, in that it becomes this pathway of discovering something within, and it becomes more visible through, all of these channels, the quotes, the stories. I am curious about the last time that you picked up this book, or maybe the last couple of times, must have been this year or last year. What stood out to you that you'd like to share?
Well, the last time I picked up this book I reread it to get ready for this.
Yeah.
It was the first time I actually read it in its original version in English.
Okay.
So for me, that was interesting because I had only read the translation.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
Was it
What stood out
different?
for
Was
me-
it different for you? Like, was it a similar but different experience?
It was a different experience, and there's something about reading it in my mother tongue
Right.
that made it a bit more reassuring for some reason. Like, and again, it's just probably an association of lived events, but yeah, it felt a bit more in my headspace when I read it in English, which in itself is interesting to notice.
Yeah, that is interesting to notice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the
And,
question of like what stood out for
yes.
you. Yeah.
Yeah. What stood out for me? Let me just look at it and see and see if I cannot. I guess if I look at it and think of it, it seems like Richard's fear of becoming a messiah, like the ones who wanted to be a messiah, but having the perks of it but not the downsides of it, was more present when I read it this time than before. I guess I was noticing other things before, but the fear that he had about, I really don't want this to happen, this tension between, and I want to learn more. I love this Messiah stuff. I love this Messiah, like the Messiah handbook. I just love this.
Yeah.
And I'm also super afraid of the crowds and what this may attract to me. Like this tension was more present, was more obvious to me last time I read it than the times before.
I actually think that that's so true, in that in the beginning, when he starts talking to his friend Donald, yeah, I think, there's this kinship that builds right away. But I find that, and this is such a short book, right? So by the time you get to 3/4 of it, you feel the strength of their relationship. And you can see that where there may have been a reluctance to think about certain concepts, now there's this craving for wanting to be challenged or to answer certain questions in a different way, and to think about life with that twist, right? Like that humor or twist, or and that challenge that the two of them have together is just so fun. And so I think I realized the same thing as you did, which is that there is this reluctance, but then there's also this deep connection to the conversation and to the thoughts that keeps getting formed for Richard. To the point where I think at the end, when there's this part where Donald says, I am, or Richard identifies, you cannot place your happiness in other people's hands.
Yes.
And Donald says, oh my God. Like, he didn't even recognize the simplicity and the brilliance of that. But it was just such an obvious truth.
Right?
Yeah, that was it.
This was the missing piece for Donald.
Yeah.
Like, wow, how much he was placing, how much he was prioritizing other people's happiness.
Yes.
And that's when he decided, so I'm just going to speak out loud, speak my mind, and then the tragic ending.
The tragic ending, yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think is the symbolism there? Okay, so for anyone who's listening, the tragic ending is that he gets shot, right? Donald gets shot, and he was about to take off for flight, and I think there was somebody who was aggravated by his opinions or disagreed to the point of having hatred in their heart, and then found him and, took his life. So that's the shocking ending. And Richard is devastated, but carries on, and he meets Donald in his dreams, in like the version of an alternate time, reality, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think is the symbolism there of, the tragic end?
This represents today's society still a whole lot about people not realizing that they're afraid, and because of the fear they become so aggravated and angry, and then they take violent action. I think we see this in the world daily. I'm thinking that a lot of violence that we're seeing in this world takes root in fear, and some of these wiser thoughts and like when it stems from love, and it again talking about responsibility, and kind of insist on, we are all responsible for this. For some, it's a hard truth, it's hard reality to accept. It creates fear, and fear may lead to violence. So for me, this is the image. Another image I like to think about is that since we are in a world where there's a lot of polarities, we often see the rise of light, and with the rise of light, we often see the rise of darkness, just because of the polarity between light and darkness. So that's another way that I give meaning to that.
Yeah. That's gorgeous. The polarity of light and dark. Like, you can't have dark without light. You can't have light without dark.
Yeah.
You can't have life without death. You can't have death without life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And breathing is inhaling and exhaling. Yeah.
Breathing is the intake of air and the expulsion of air. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I know this one's hard to do because it's such a deep, profound book, and you've read it 20 plus times now. But if you were to be given the challenge of summing up the essence of this Illusions book, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah, and if you were to be challenged to sum up the essence of this book in either a single word or a phrase, what would it be and why?
Oh la la. A few things come to mind, but let me just pause a bit. well, illusions. The title is a perfect title. Yeah, I think there's that. Yeah, yeah. I think the author named it well. There's also, that famous sentence that is used in one of the Spider-Man movies: "With great power comes great responsibility." I think there's a bit of that too that comes to mind.
When you think of
Yeah.
illusions, because I think you said it beautifully. You said the title of the book, like that's the essence of the book is illusions. How does
Yeah.
that show up in your everyday life? This reminder of everything's an illusion.
Well, it depends on I'm going to say my wise days and my not so
Sure,
wise
sure,
days.
we all have them. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. On my not so wise days, the illusions or the beliefs and the assumptions that I go by
Right.
are a little bit less noble. And I get carried into the stories I tell myself, and I take
Right.
them to be true, and that's it. And then I get aggravated, but not because of the events, but because of the story I make up in my head.
Yes.
And on wise days, I notice this internal game,
Yes.
and I notice sometimes even in other people, which allows me to welcome it and be with and just remain in a place of love and acceptance. And there's the deliberate, like the advocacy that we have with illusions that I think gives it a lot of power.
Mm.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
Well, the way I experience this is as I strengthened my capacity to witness what's happening inside of me, my reaction, the structure that I use to make meaning of what's happening around me, inside of me, as I start to see it more, and it's like a secret code I decipher, then I can be more deliberate about, okay, is this working for me? Is this not working for me? Do I want to update it or not? Can I update it or not? If I cannot, then what's the underlying, I'm going to use the word program underneath it,
Yeah.
that may be the real obstacle. And so, hence me feeling I'm a pilgrim in consciousness, because I'm just always in a, most of the time I like to pay attention to this and to see what's happening and what's at work here underneath the water.
Ooh, what's at work here underneath the water? Yeah. For me, when I think of the word illusions, and the story is such a beautiful way of getting me here, I think often about the rules that we live by.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, I feel that's the illusion. That
That's a
there
good
is
good
there is a
perspective.
rule, there's a rule playbook or I don't know, this code of how we operate with one another that are these rules of being. And I so often think about, like, it's all made up. All of this stuff is made up. We have made it up, and then it's been passed down through culture, time, space, all that stuff. And there are these rules that just don't get questioned anymore. So to me, I feel like that comes up to mind a lot when I think of rules. And then as well, the illusion is also in everything. Like I'll often look at objects, like anything around you. I'll pick something up and I'll say, that was an idea in someone's brain. Like that
Yeah.
was an image that was in someone's brain that was in no way a real thing that you can tangibly hold, touch, smell, feel, anything. And so to me, when I think of illusions, I also think of the power of how do you create from your brain or your heart, how do you make it real is the other version of illusions to me. So I challenge
Yeah.
the rules and also the power of creating from nothing.
Yeah. And in the power of creating with illusions, it's a little bit like um what I had some like what I think is true or not.
Yes.
Like, let's say you take this and say, okay, well, I have this idea, but it's not possible. So therefore, the illusion is that it's not possible. So I'm just putting it on the
down,
side.
yeah.
But if I bend that illusion and I see through it, it's like, well, it might be possible. And then that kind of loosening of the illusion or the belief, that kind of leads to more possibilities and more opportunities and more creations. Yeah.
I don't know if you're a Matrix fan, but this reminds me of that movie, The Matrix, where it's all these kids practicing playing with their mind. And there was this one girl who's bending the spoon. And Neo, who's the character, he goes up to her and he's like, how did you do that? And she goes, there is no spoon. So when you bend it, like, it's not a spoon anymore.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I remember when I started my business before joining Leadership Circle a few years ago, and I started it, it's pure coincidence, but it was the first day of the pandemic lockdown in my area. And that was the first day of me as an entrepreneur. Pure coincidence.
Amazing.
So, and I succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
I succeeded in this context. And then my mother asked me, how did you do it? And I said, for me, the possibility that it would not work was not there. Like, it was just, it will work. Like, whatever path it takes, it's going to happen. So I think there's a bit like, there's no spoon.
Yes.
I think there's a little bit of the same thing.
Yes.
And we hear these stories all the time about people that may have disabilities that succeed at amazing challenges. And like, well, for them, there was like, it's just fun and they're not thinking that it's not possible. I think Wayne Dyer says a lot about that. Like, if you're thinking it's impossible, it will be impossible.
That's the thing about illusions, is you can make it work for you too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like if you think it's possible, well, it becomes possible. And there's something about in the book, I think, like, speak about your limits and they become yours, something like that. I think there's a lot to this.
That's so
like,
true.
If I believe that I'm not a fast runner, I'll never run fast. No. I mean, I might be okay with that, and I don't need to update that belief, but there's something about that. If I'm not a sports person, if I'm not a healthy person, I can never be. The first step would be yeah. Why would I be? Because I think I cannot be.
Yeah. It's not in my narrative. I think I cannot be.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Hence the importance of updating the narrative, the power of that.
Yeah.
It's basically updating the whole illusion, right?
I have a little girl, so I often think about this in context of language and what you say to yourself. Because that's, it starts when you're very, very young. Like, I can't be that, or of course I'm going to do that, or I can't do that yet, right? Like, the power of language and how that forms your psyche. I think of the stuff that we tell ourselves, or the stuff that we tell to others that feels like a duh. I can't run as fast as my friend. Or whatever it may be. Like, that's just a simple example. But I think about this often, about the power of what you've decided as your identity.
Yeah.
And the power of then also breaking those rules and saying, I can change my identity if I want to, if I choose to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot in there with the identity specifically, because a lot of our identity is something that was acquired by other people telling us who we were supposed to be. So, okay, well, I must be this type of person, and I must be, people keep telling me that I'm a crier, so I must be a crier then.
Oh my gosh,
so
yes.
These types of things that we build our personality around, until we kind of realize, well, there might be something else. And if we think about that even further, like, we could even challenge some things that seem obvious for us right now. Like, I know I'm going to sound crazy, but what if we would challenge the fact that human beings cannot fly?
Right.
Maybe there's a way we can fly, we just have not discovered yet.
Absolutely.
I mean, I would love that, but and actually there's something about that passion that's also Richard is passionate in the book and in other books too, like finding a way for humans to fly without an aircraft. Yeah.
Have you ever gone paragliding?
No, not yet.
I would definitely recommend, because what they've done, And, this is obviously a side, but what they've done is they've seen how birds channel the wind tunnels, and how, like, they're not flapping their wings all the time because that takes a lot of energy, but they figure out how to channel these wind channels, and then they kind of like glide with it, and they increase their height as a consequence of like spiraling up. And so I once did paragliding, and it was following the patterns of a bird and what they would see, the wind that they see. And it was amazing because you're in flight for 10, 15 minutes. You're not free falling. You're literally gliding up. So just
Nice.
aside, after this podcast, you're going to be booking
Yeah.
your next adventure.
For sure. Absolutely.
But you're right.
Absolutely.
Like, why can't a human don on a pair of wings and go for it? Why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit like the bumblebee, right? You've heard of the bumblebee
No,
effect?
tell me.
The bumblebee, if you look at what we know about aerodynamics, should not be able to fly.
Right.
The shape of it, the size of its wing, the weight of it, it should not fly.
Right.
If we look at our laws of aerodynamic. However, the bumblebee doesn't know these laws, so it flies.
Right. Right.
So what else would be possible if we would shift
what
we take for granted?
What actually do humans know? What do we
Yeah.
actually know?
That's a deep question. We don't know squat. I know. We think we know, but
Yeah, we think
maybe
we
not that
know.
much.
Like, we enjoy feeling like we're so smart and so wise and know it all. But there's
I love that feeling of feeling smart. I just love feeling smart.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you on that. So much of what you're talking about also reminds me of leadership circle profile, where it's like there's so much of the way that we are that feels very reactive. Like, we react and we're in this, defense mode all the time. And then there's that breakthrough into what is it like when we dive into the land of creating, right? Because there's so much of identity that needs to be shed as you take over from the space of like reacting and being in default thinking or default modes of action, or, doing things the way that you always do because that's the way that you've always done it. And there's almost this breaking through, like this shedding of your old skin, like snake analogy, as you adapt a different way of creating and thinking about the world that you live in.
Yeah. It's a major shift. It's one of the most important shifts we can make in our adult lives, is that shift from, leadership circle, we call it from reactive to creative, but in other models, it's that shift from socialized to self-authored, if we look at Keegan, but that shift from maybe a little bit less egocentric and more about ecocentric, if we want to use Otto Scharmer's words. But there's this shift that all of a sudden, I'm not just my stories. There might be something else there, and getting curious about that.
I love that. And all of this from this book that you picked up,
short read
that you picked up from your family's home that had no place to be there.
Absolutely.
And it's been with you for decades now.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just a moment of silence for that, because that is amazing. When I sometimes think about the impact of books, and then you cross that with the impact of books over time, and then you cross that with the impacts of books over time across all the decades that you're living your life. The compounding effect of one decision of, I'm going to read this book, it lives in a whole different spectrum, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Books are powerful, I find. There's we invest time when we read them, and there's something about them that, it's almost like a ritual, like choosing a book, reading it.
Yeah. This was a great read. If there is another one that you feel has built you or impacted you in a big way, what book would that be?
I think it would be Your Brain at Work, from the Neuro Leadership Institute by but I can't remember the name of the guy.
David
That
Rock.
makes me mad. But thank you.
David Rock. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. That book really got me thinking a whole lot about neuroscience. I am an NLP coach, so there's something about neuroprogramming that really fascinates me.
Right.
And that book really influenced how I have an L&D background. So I was working in learning and development most of my career, if not all of my career. And when I read that book, I started to embed some of these principles into my trainings.
Mm-hmm.
And even with my son, he's about to be 8, and it's all about, going towards like this whole, the way the brain works and the way it presents it. It's so simple. So like it again, quick, easy read, maybe not as quick as Illusions, but it's an easy read, very accessible neuroscience for all. So that book really had an impression on me. Yeah.
I love that. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And maybe we can have you on a different episode to talk about that book, because I'm adding that to my cart right away. That sounds so fascinating. And the title is Your Brain at Work: Strategies for Overcoming Distraction, Regaining Focus, and Working Smarter All Day Long. That sounds like something we all strive to do. So adding to cart right away.
It's well written too. It's very, very,
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for this wonderful, enlightening, easy, lighthearted, and just such an impactful conversation that you've had with me today. I so appreciate you.
Thank you, Shar, for making the time, making the space, for inviting me. I just love bathing into this content, and having this conversation with you is just making me thoroughly happy and content. So thank you very much.
You're
really
so welcome.
this.
Oh, you're so welcome. And that's it for this episode of Books That Built Me. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a review. It really helps support what we're doing here. Thanks for listening, and you can always find me on my LinkedIn at Shar Banerjee. If you're dealing with a leadership challenge, I would love to hear from you and have you join our community. And of course, I will talk to you next Tuesday on a brand new episode of Books That Built Me.